1776, by David McCullough. Introduction. Imagine for a moment, it's late on a frigid, storm-tossed Christmas night. The wind is howling, driving a cruel mix of snow and sleet that feels like tiny needles on your skin. You're standing on the banks of a river choked with ice, so wide you can't see the other side. You haven't slept in days. You're hungry, you're freezing, and your shoes, if you even have any, are soaked through. And you are about to get into a boat to cross that treacherous river, to march 9 more miles in the dark, and attack a fortified town held by professional soldiers who are warm and asleep in their beds. It sounds like madness. A suicide mission. Yet this is the very precipice where the American Revolution stood in the final days of 1776. The cause of liberty wasn't just losing. By all rational measure, it was already lost. The army was broken, the public was losing faith, and the world's greatest military power was closing in for the final kill. In the center of it all was a man you might think you know, George Washington. But this wasn't the stoic figure on the dollar bill. This was a man plagued by self-doubt, betrayed by his own officers, and so overwhelmed by the sheer hopelessness of it all that he privately confessed he wished he could just retire to a wigwam in the wilderness. Today, we're diving into David McCullough's masterpiece, 1776. This book isn't just a history lesson, it's a gripping human drama that has sold millions of copies and won the Pulitzer Prize, because it does something extraordinary. It transports us back to that pivotal year and makes us feel the biting cold, the suffocating fear, and the flickering hope of the people who lived through it. By the end of our journey today, you won't just know what happened in 1776. You will understand how it happened. You'll discover the secret to how a disorganized, demoralized group of farmers and tradesmen, a rabble in arms, as their enemies called them, found the courage to face down an empire against impossible odds. The answer lies not in grand strategies or political speeches, but in the raw, unyielding power of human character. And it's a lesson that is as vital today as it was then. Book summary. Our story doesn't begin in the muddy, desperate camps of the American rebels. It begins in London, the magnificent, glittering heart of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. On a clear autumn day in 1775, King George III rides from St. James's Palace to the Palace of Westminster in a colossal golden chariot pulled by 8 perfectly matched cream-colored horses. The ground trembles as the 4-ton carriage rolls past, a rolling symbol of the wealth and might of the British Empire. 60,000 people line the streets, cheering for their king. This is the man who is the ultimate authority, the sovereign of it all. And it's important we understand him, because he is not the one-dimensional tyrant we often imagine. George III was, in many ways, a simple man. He preferred plain food, disliked wearing a wig, and was deeply devoted to his wife and their 15 children. He was a man of culture who loved music, art, and architecture. He was hard-working, sincere, and driven by a powerful sense of duty. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was doing what was right. And to him, the growing unrest in America was not a debate over rights, it was a rebellion, a desperate conspiracy by a few ambitious traitors who were misleading the populace. America, he felt, must be made to obey. His duty was clear. George, be a king, his mother had told him, and he intended to be one. In Parliament, this view was widely shared. The Americans were seen as a disorganized, undisciplined, and cowardly mob. One general famously boasted that with just 5,000 British regulars, he could march from one end of the American continent to the other. There were dissenting voices, like the brilliant Edmund Burke, who argued for conciliation, but even he referred to America as our colonies. The supremacy of the British Empire was not a question, it was a fact of life. So when the king stood before Parliament that day, His voice ringing with conviction, he declared America in a state of open revolt. He announced he was sending more troops, more ships, and even hiring foreign mercenaries, Hessian soldiers from Germany, to put a speedy end to the disorder. For King George, this was not a war of conquest, but of correction. It was a father disciplining a rebellious child. There was no doubt in his mind, or in the minds of most in Britain, about who would prevail. Now, let's travel 3,000 miles across the ocean, to the American camp outside Boston. And here, we meet a very different man, facing a very different reality. His name is George Washington. At 43, he is commander-in-chief of what is grandly called the Continental Army, but as he looks out over his troops, he sees no army. He sees a rabble in arms, a collection of farmers and shopkeepers, boys and old men, dressed in rags, armed with ancient muskets, and utterly lacking in discipline. In a private letter, Washington confides his despair. The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep, he writes. Few people know the predicament we are in. The predicament was this: he was laying siege to Boston, a city occupied by thousands of professional British soldiers, the best in the world. Yet Washington's army was on the verge of collapse. They had almost no gunpowder, perhaps only 9 rounds per man. They had no uniforms, no flag, and very few tents. The camps were filthy, and disease, what they called camp fever, was rampant, killing more men than combat ever would. Dysentery, typhus, and typhoid swept through the ranks. And the men themselves were a commander's nightmare. They were fiercely independent New Englanders who had volunteered to fight, but they saw no reason to follow orders they didn't agree with. They elected their own officers, who were often as ignorant of military life as the men they led. They wandered off from camp to dig for clams or go home to help with the harvest. In his private letters, Washington, a Virginia aristocrat accustomed to order and deference, fumes with frustration. He calls them exceeding dirty and nasty and laments their unaccountable kind of stupidity. Could I have foreseen what I have and am like to experience, he confesses, no consideration upon earth should have induced me to accept this command. He was a man who prized order, architecture, and precision, a man meticulously designing additions to his beloved Mount Vernon even as the world around him fell apart. And here he was, trying to forge an army out of chaos, surrounded by men who seemed to have no concept of discipline. And there was another, even more terrifying problem. The enlistments for most of his soldiers were set to expire at the end of the year. The entire army was simply going to vanish in a matter of months. Everyone had expected a short campaign. Washington himself had told his wife, Martha, he'd be home by fall. But as the fall of 1775 turned to winter, the British remained securely fortified in Boston, and the American cause seemed to be freezing to death. It's in this moment of near total darkness that we see the first spark of the genius that would define the American effort. The problem seemed impossible. The British were in Boston, protected by their powerful navy. The Americans were outside, with no way to attack. The stalemate was slowly bleeding the life out of the revolution. Washington knew he had to do something, anything, to break the deadlock. And the answer came from the most unlikely of sources. Not a seasoned general, but a 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox. Knox was a man you couldn't miss. He was 6 feet tall and weighed 250 pounds, with a booming voice and a jovial, energetic nature. Like Nathaniel Greene, the brilliant, self-taught Quaker who had become Washington's most trusted general, Knox was a student of military science, learning all he could from the books he sold in his shop. And he had a truly audacious idea. Months earlier, a small band of rebels led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured Fort Ticonderoga, a British fort on Lake Champlain in upstate New York. It was a stunning victory, but the fort was remote, and its prize, dozens of heavy cannon and mortars, lay abandoned, hundreds of miles away. Knox proposed to Washington that he could retrieve those cannon and haul them overland, through the wilderness of the Berkshire Mountains, in the dead of winter, all the way to Boston. It was an idea so enormous, so fraught with difficulty, that most would have dismissed it as impossible. But Washington, desperate for a solution, agreed at once. He saw in this young, confident bookseller a spark of the same perseverance he so valued in himself. And so began one of the great epics of the Revolution. Knox set off in November 1775. The journey was a nightmare. He and his men had to move nearly 60 tons of artillery, some cannons weighing over 5,000 pounds, across frozen lakes, through deep snow, and over mountains from which we might almost have seen all the kingdoms of the earth, as Knox wrote in his diary. They built huge sleds and rounded up 80 yoke of oxen. But there was no snow. Then came a cruel thaw, turning the roads to mud. Then a blizzard buried them in 3 feet of snow. When they reached the Hudson River, the ice was too thin to cross. Knox had his men cut holes in the ice, hoping the water that flooded the surface would freeze and thicken it. When one of the heaviest cannons crashed through the ice and sank to the bottom of the river, he refused to give up, spending a full day to retrieve it. To slow the descent of the sleds down the steep mountain passes, they anchored ropes to trees and shoved brush under the runners. It was a journey of almost 300 miles, an incredible feat of engineering, logistics, and sheer, stubborn willpower. And by late January 1776, Knox's noble train of artillery arrived outside Boston. He hadn't lost a single cannon. Now, Washington had the key. His plan was as brilliant and audacious as Knox's journey. He would do to the British what they had failed to do to him. He would seize the high ground. Specifically, Dorchester Heights, a pair of hills that overlooked both the city and the harbor. The British commanders knew the strategic importance of the heights. They had even talked of fortifying it themselves but, in a display of arrogance and inertia, had done nothing. They assumed the rebels would never dare such a move. Washington planned to prove them wrong. The problem was the ground on the heights was frozen solid as rock. Digging trenches would be impossible, and the noise would surely alert the British. So, drawing on an idea from one of his officers, Rufus Putnam, they devised a plan of incredible ingenuity. They would build the fortifications in secret, prefabricated out of timber frames, bundles of branches, and hay bales. Then, under the cover of a single night, they would haul everything, including Knox's heavy cannons, to the top of the heights. To cover the noise, Washington ordered a massive artillery barrage from other positions around Boston for 2 consecutive nights. The British, thinking it was just another pointless bombardment, fired back with all they had, their cannonade providing the perfect cover for Washington's real plan. On the night of March 4, 1776, under the light of a full moon, the operation began. 2,000 men moved silently across the narrow causeway to Dorchester, shielded from view by a wall of hay bales. Ox teams and wagons hauled the prefabricated walls and the heavy guns up the steep frozen slopes. It was an utterly phenomenal achievement. As one observer wrote, "Perhaps there never was so much work done in so short a space of time." At daybreak, the British commanders in Boston looked up at the heights and could scarcely believe their eyes. It was as if a fortress had sprung up from the ground overnight, as if by the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp. General William Howe, the British commander, was said to have exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." The American guns on Dorchester Heights now commanded the city and the harbor. The British fleet was a sitting duck. The British admiral sent Howe an urgent message: the ships could not remain unless the rebels were removed. Howe, a brave and experienced soldier who had led the bloody charge at Bunker Hill, knew he had to attack. His pride and honor demanded it. He ordered 2,000 troops to prepare for an assault. On the American side, the men were in high spirits, ready for a fight. Washington himself rode among them, reminding them that it was the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. But then, the elements took over. A storm of hurricane force swept in, with blinding snow and sleet. The British attack had to be called off. And by the time the storm subsided, the American fortifications were even stronger. Howe realized an attack would be a repeat of the carnage at Bunker Hill, a victory he could not afford. He had been completely and brilliantly outmaneuvered. He had no choice. He would have to evacuate Boston. On March 17, 1776, the British fleet, carrying nearly 9,000 troops and over 1,000 loyalists, sailed out of Boston Harbor. After a siege of nearly a year, the city was free. It was the first great victory of the war, a stunning triumph for Washington and his rabble in arms. It was a victory won not with superior numbers or firepower, but with audacity, ingenuity, and incredible perseverance. The news spread like wildfire through the colonies, bringing thrilling hope to the American cause. Congress ordered a gold medal struck in Washington's honor. He was hailed as a hero. But Washington had no illusions. He knew this was not the end, but only the beginning. And as he led his army south, marching toward their next great test in New York, he knew that the war was about to enter a new, far more dangerous stage. The victory at Boston had been a masterpiece of defensive strategy. But now, in New York, Washington would make a decision that would lead him, and the cause of independence, to the very brink of annihilation. New York in 1776 was not the city we know. It was a bustling port of about 20,000 people, crowded onto the southern tip of Manhattan Island. But geographically, it was a defender's nightmare. It was an island, surrounded by deep, navigable rivers, a place that, as General Charles Lee had warned Washington, whoever commands the sea must command the town. And the British commanded the sea. In early summer, the might of the British Empire appeared in New York Harbor. It was the largest expeditionary force of the 18th century, the most powerful fleet ever sent forth from Britain. Over 400 ships, including 73 warships, carrying 32,000 soldiers, a professional, well-armed, well-trained army that outnumbered the entire population of Philadelphia, the largest city in America. The masts of the ships, anchored in the bay, looked like a forest. To the Americans, it was a display of power beyond imagination. Against this, Washington had an army that, on paper, numbered perhaps 20,000, but in reality, only about half were fit for duty. They were still poorly trained, poorly equipped, and plagued by sickness. So why did Washington choose to defend a place that was so clearly indefensible? The decision was more political than military. He knew that Congress and the country expected him to make a stand. To abandon New York without a fight would have been a devastating blow to morale. So, against his better military judgment, he prepared to defend the city. And in doing so, he violated one of the most fundamental rules of warfare. He divided his army. He kept part of his force in Manhattan and sent the other part across the East River to Long Island, to defend the crucial high ground of Brooklyn Heights. He believed he could shuttle troops back and forth across the river as needed. It was a gamble that presumed he would control the river. It was a fatal mistake. While Washington waited, trying to guess where the British would strike, a momentous event took place in Philadelphia. On July 2, Congress voted to dissolve the connection with Great Britain. 2 days later, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. When the news reached New York, Washington had the Declaration read aloud to his troops. For the first time, they were no longer fighting for their rights as Englishmen, but for a new, independent nation. The general hopes, his orders read, This important event will serve as a fresh incentive to every officer and soldier to act with fidelity and courage. That night, a mob of soldiers and citizens stormed down Broadway and pulled down the gilded lead statue of King George III, a symbolic act of defiance. The lead, it was said, would be melted down into bullets. But declarations and toppled statues don't win wars. On August 22, the British made their move. In a perfectly executed amphibious landing, 15,000 troops went ashore at Gravesend Bay on Long Island, unopposed. Washington, still convinced it was a feint, sent only a few reinforcements, leaving his force on Long Island dangerously outnumbered. The American plan was to defend the heights of Gowan, a wooded ridge that stood between the British and the American fortifications at Brooklyn. It was rough, difficult terrain, with only a few main roads, or passes, cutting through it. The Americans believed this was their advantage. In the woods, they could fight the British on their own terms. But they made a catastrophic blunder. They left one of the passes, the Jamaica Pass on the far left flank, almost completely unguarded. General Henry Clinton, the shrewdest of the British commanders, discovered this vulnerability. And on the night of August 26, he led 10,000 British troops on a silent 9-mile march through the darkness, through the unguarded Jamaica Pass, and came up behind the entire American line. The Battle of Brooklyn, which began on the morning of August 27, was a disaster. The Americans, believing they were holding their own against frontal attacks, suddenly found themselves surrounded, attacked from the front and the rear. It was a rout. The lines collapsed. Men panicked and ran for their lives. Only on the right flank did a pocket of resistance hold out. There, Lord Stirling and a few hundred men from Maryland and Delaware fought with incredible valor, launching a series of suicidal charges against a far superior British force to cover the retreat of the others. Washington, watching through his telescope from Brooklyn Heights, is said to have cried out, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." By noon, it was over. The first great battle of the war was a crushing, humiliating defeat. The Americans had lost over 1,000 men, most of them taken prisoner, including 2 generals. And the rest of the army, some 9,000 men, were now trapped in their fortifications at Brooklyn, their backs to the East River, with a victorious British army in front of them. It seemed the war was about to end. General Howe had only to press his attack, or have his brother's fleet sail up the East River, and the American army would be annihilated. But Howe, ever cautious, and perhaps remembering the cost of Bunker Hill, decided to halt. He would lay siege to the American works, rather than risk a frontal assault. This decision gave Washington his only chance. And what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. For 2 days, a cold, driving rainstorm, a northeaster, kept the British fleet from moving up the river. Then, on the night of August 29, under the cover of that storm and in almost supernatural darkness, Washington executed one of the most brilliant retreats in military history. Every available boat was rounded up. And once again, it was Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead mariners, the same fishermen and sailors who had served so well at Boston, who manned the boats. In a feat of extraordinary seamanship, they ferried 9,000 men, along with their horses, supplies, and cannon, across the mile-wide, turbulent river, in the dark, without the British ever knowing. The entire operation was conducted in profound silence. Wagon wheels were muffled with rags. Orders were given in whispers. Time was running out. As dawn approached, a large part of the army was still waiting to embark. Discovery seemed certain. Then, an incredible stroke of luck. A heavy fog settled over Brooklyn, concealing the last stages of the retreat, while the New York side of the river remained perfectly clear. When the British finally advanced on the American lines in the morning, they found them empty. The American army had vanished. It was an incredible escape, a masterpiece of logistics and leadership that saved the army from destruction. But it was still a retreat. They had been outsmarted, outfought, and driven from Long Island. And now, they had to face the inevitable. They could not hold New York. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. The army, once full of spirit, was now gripped by despair. Defeat had shattered their confidence. Soldiers began deserting by the hundreds. Entire militia units simply packed up and went home. On September 15, the British struck again. Under the cover of a ferocious naval bombardment at a place called Kip's Bay, they landed on Manhattan Island. The American militia posted there, green troops who had never faced such a terrifying onslaught of cannon fire, broke and ran without firing a shot. Washington, racing to the scene, came upon his men flying in every direction. He was overcome with a volcanic rage. He cursed them, struck at them with his riding crop, and in his fury, rode to within 100 yards of the enemy, seemingly heedless of his own life, before his aides could grab his horse's bridle and pull him away. The British took New York City with ease. The American army was in a full, panicked retreat northward up the island. It seemed the final collapse had come. But the next day, in a small but vicious skirmish known as the Battle of Harlem Heights, a group of American Rangers fought back with surprising ferocity, driving a superior British force into a retreat. It was a small victory, but psychologically, it was immense. It proved that Americans could stand and fight, that the Redcoats were not invincible. It was a badly needed injection of courage. For the next month, the two armies faced each other in a tense standoff. But Washington knew he couldn't stay. Howe, with his control of the water, could outflank him at any time. So, the long retreat began again. Washington moved his army north, into Westchester County, abandoning all but the northernmost tip of Manhattan, where a garrison held a fortification high above the Hudson called Fort Washington. The decision to leave troops at Fort Washington was another terrible blunder, born of indecision and the misguided optimism of Nathanael Greene. On November 16, the fort was attacked by a vastly superior force of British and Hessian troops. After a few hours of brutal fighting, the fort surrendered. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers were taken prisoner. It was the most devastating blow of the war, an utter catastrophe that cost Washington nearly a quarter of his army. Watching the tragedy unfold from across the river, Washington is said to have wept. Now the retreat was in earnest. With the British under the aggressive General Cornwallis in hot pursuit, Washington led his dwindling army across New Jersey. It was a long retreat, a desperate flight for survival. The men were in tatters, many without shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the frozen mud. The army was melting away. Enlistments were expiring. By the time Washington reached the Delaware River in early December, his army numbered fewer than 3,000 men. It was, as Nathanael Greene wrote, a very pitiful army to trust the liberties of America on. Across New Jersey, people were giving up. Thousands flocked to the British to swear allegiance to the king. The cause seemed hopeless. In Philadelphia, Congress, fearing the British were about to capture the city, abandoned it and fled to Baltimore. Washington managed to get his army across the Delaware River, seizing every boat he could find to prevent the British from following. But he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As soon as the river froze solid, the British could walk across and finish him off. "I think the game is pretty near up," he wrote in a moment of utter despair. It is here, at the absolute lowest point of the war, with everything on the line, that our story reaches its climax. The British, confident that the rebellion was crushed, had gone into winter quarters, establishing a string of outposts across New Jersey. The post at Trenton, on the Delaware, was held by 1,500 Hessians, professional soldiers who held the American rebels in contempt. Washington knew he had to do something, one last, desperate gamble. He would cross the Delaware and attack Trenton. It was a plan born of what he called dire necessity. And so we return to that storm-tossed Christmas night. Washington and his 2,400 men cross the ice-choked river in a northeaster. The crossing takes hours longer than planned. They are soaked, freezing, and exhausted. They march 9 miles through the snow and sleet in the dark. Their guns are so wet they might not fire. Washington's orders are simple: use the bayonet. They reach Trenton at 8 in the morning, an hour after daylight, their hopes of a surprise attack in the dark now gone. But the storm, which had so hampered them, had also provided cover. The Hessians are completely unprepared. The battle is short and savage. Knox's artillery sweeps the main streets. The Americans, who had been running for months, now charge with a fury born of desperation. The Hessians, caught by surprise and surrounded, are overwhelmed. Within 45 minutes, it's over. Nearly 900 Hessians are captured. Incredibly, not a single American is killed in the fighting. Washington and his men recross the Delaware with their prisoners, having marched and fought for nearly 36 hours straight in unimaginable conditions. The victory at Trenton was more than a military victory. It was a thunderclap of hope that electrified the country. The news spread through the colonies, reviving the dying spirit of the Revolution. It proved that the army had not been beaten, that Washington was still a leader to be reckoned with, and that the cause was not lost. Days later, Washington would cross the river again, and in another brilliant stroke, defeat a British force at Princeton. In the space of 10 days, he had completely turned the tables, driven the British from most of New Jersey, and saved the American Revolution. The campaign of 1776, which had been a year of almost unrelenting defeat and despair, ended with two of the most astonishing, unlikely victories in American history. Commentary. When you look back at that incredible year, 1776, it's tempting to see it as a story of inevitable triumph, a story with a known ending. But as David McCullough so powerfully shows us, for the people living through it, the outcome was anything but certain. In fact, for most of that year, the American cause was on the verge of complete and total failure. So what is the great lesson of 1776? What can we, living in a world so different, take from this story of hardship and hope? I think the answer is not found in the grand declarations or the political debates. It's found in the character of the people who endured. It's a lesson about perseverance. It's about what happens when you refuse to give up, even when everything, and everyone, is telling you that you've already lost. Think about George Washington. This book gives us a portrait of him not as a flawless icon, but as a deeply human leader, wrestling with his own doubts and frustrations. He made mistakes, serious, costly mistakes. His decision to defend New York was a strategic blunder that nearly cost him everything. His indecision over Fort Washington led to a catastrophe. He was, as he himself admitted, not equal to the command he had been given. And yet, he held it all together. He learned from his mistakes. He bore the weight of it all, the defeats, the desertions, the betrayals, with a fortitude that is almost impossible to comprehend. When everything was falling apart, he was the one who did not break. He drew on a reserve of inner strength and determination that seemed to grow stronger the more desperate the situation became. As Nathanael Greene observed, Washington never appeared to so much advantage as in the hour of distress. And think of the ordinary soldiers. The men who left their farms and families, who marched for months in rags, who slept in the mud and snow, who faced down the best army in the world with little more than courage. Men like Joseph Hodgkins, who, after learning of the death of his young son, still wrote to his wife that he must stay, because the cause demanded it. These were not summer soldiers or sunshine patriots, as Thomas Paine called them. They were the men who stood it when it mattered most. The story of 1776 teaches us that history is not made by impersonal forces. It is made by people. It is shaped by their courage, their foolishness, their resilience, and their ability to endure. The victories at Trenton and Princeton were not just tactical successes, they were triumphs of the human spirit. They were a testament to the idea that a small group of determined people, led by a leader who will not quit, can change the course of history. So what can you do with this? How does a story from so long ago apply to your life today? Well, first, it's a powerful reminder that the most difficult times are often the ones that forge the greatest strength. Washington became the leader we remember not in the easy times, but in the crucible of the long retreat. When you face your own dark hours, remember that these are the moments that define you. And second, it's a lesson in the power of the brilliant stroke. For months, Washington's army was on the defensive, just trying to survive. But he was always watching, always looking for an opportunity, no matter how small, to strike back. He knew that one bold, unexpected move could change everything. In your own life, when you feel overwhelmed or on the defensive, don't just endure. Look for your Trenton. Look for that one place where a small, courageous action can create a turning point. That was a summary of 1776 by David McCullough. We've journeyed through the main events today, but I have to be honest with you, a summary can only show you the map of the territory. The real magic happens when you walk the ground yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase from McCullough's writing hits you in a way you didn't expect. This overview is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time and attention. If anything we've talked about today has stirred something in you, if you felt a flicker of the fear, the desperation, or the incredible courage of that year, then please, grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you think about leadership, perseverance, and the foundations of this country. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it sparked your curiosity, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.